Hey class. So this past week we've been talking about the blood, right? And we went through all these different cells, red blood cells that are so important for transporting oxygen, white blood cells that are acting in pathogen defense, platelets, which are stopping bleeding, hemostasis, and then the plasma, right? That's there to help regulate blood temperature, body temperature, and to transport all these important things like hormones and proteins and cells, right? So we have this fantastic fluid, and now we're looking at the fact, well, we need some way to get this around the body. And that brings us to this week. So we're really jumping into now the cardiovascular system. Now, even if you look at the name cardio and then vascular, cardio is describing the pump. That's going to be the heart, the topic of this week's discussion. And then the vascular system are the pipes, right? These are going to be the blood vessels, and we'll get more into that next week. So we are focusing in on the heart, and I know a lot of you already looked at the heart and started working on naming some of those structures, getting ready for lab. So we'll talk a little bit about the anatomy and then spend a little more time on the physiology. I think that's probably going to be our topic on Thursday, is focused more on the physiology as well. So as we look at the heart, as we look at this pump, right, it's important to remember that this pump gets no rest, right? It has to have strength, it needs endurance, it beats something like 100,000 times a day, right? And if it stops, you die. In fact, heart failure is the #1 cause of death in the US. This pump is also actually two pumps in one, right? Two pumps side by side. So the right-hand side of the heart is what we call the pulmonary circuit, right? It's going to be propelling blood to the lungs, both lungs, in order to get gas exchange. The left side of the heart is part of what we call the systemic circuit, right? And the systemic circuit is the whole rest of the body. So here we see the left-hand side of the heart pumping blood. Some of it's going up to the head, some of it's going out to the body, right? So this is actually a really key thing that's going to help you make sense of the rest of the chapter, right? Is that we have these two pumps side by side. And again, the right-hand side of the heart is the pulmonary circuit, and the left-hand side is the systemic circuit. Now, you've got to remember too that we're like backwards, right? And so you're always thinking about this on the patient's behalf, and that gets a little tricky. This is that same image from your textbook, figure 20.1, showing the systemic circulation and then also the pulmonary circulation. So the heart, this pump, is super important. And so our body has it in a location that is very well protected. So a couple things to think about the heart, right? We know it's in the thoracic cavity, right, in the chest, but more specifically, we would say that this is in the mediastinum. So the mediastinum is kind of this central cavity inside of the thoracic cavity. And basically this is behind the sternum. Actually, you might like this picture. So this is the picture from your book. This is actually looking down, right? So here we have the sternum, right? So this whole area then is the mediastinum. Right, so the sternum on the front is an important part of this protection. It's got the pleural cavity on either side, so there's protection there from the lungs. So this cavity contains things like the heart, the great vessels like the vena cava, the aorta, pulmonary trunk, things like that. And it also includes, let's see, oh, yep, it's on there, the esophagus, and also the trachea. So you can see the bronchi coming off here. So that's what's going on in the mediastinum. Really important that this stays protected. Another part of this protection is the pericardium, or the pericardial sac. So you saw this on your cats when you were looking for things like the thymus, right? The heart is in a sac, and the sac is called the pericardium. Now the perimeter around cardium, heart. So it goes around the heart. And they talk about it as a double-walled sac, and it's actually kind of a triple-walled sac, right? So the pericardium, you have the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. This fibrous pericardium is a dense connective tissue, right? So, and you can kind of see here, it's this thick white wall. It's actually anchoring the heart to things up like those great vessels, the vena cava, the aorta. It's going to prevent the heart from overfilling, so it provides like a maximum size that the heart could potentially stretch to. And it is a really thick connective tissue, so it's also providing some protection. When you move in to the serous pericardium, you're dealing with a double serous membrane. So a serous membrane, you have to think back to chapter 4 maybe, right? Thinking about the tissues. And so what we have here as part of this serous pericardium, so a serous membrane produces serous fluid. And so we have a parietal pericardium and a visceral pericardium, which is also called the epicardium. The parietal pericardium, notice it's basically lining the inside of that fibrous pericardium. I know this is I've said pericardium way too many times. So it lines the fibrous pericardium. The visceral pericardium is this little pink line here. Literally, it's the outside of the heart. So the other term for it, epicardium, we'll talk about when we talk about the heart, the layers of the heart wall, and we'll talk about the epicardium. They are the same thing. So what you end up, the way I always remember that, because you'll see this over and over again as we're going through body cavities, you'll have a visceral and a parietal pleura, a visceral and a parietal peritoneum, a visceral and right? So visceral is always the one that's on the side of the organ. So I think about like to eviscerate someone means to like spill open their guts. And so visceral is going to be on the organ side. See, you might remember that. Between these two layers, right, so between the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium, we see that there's a little space, right? This is the pericardial cavity, and this is filled with a serous fluid. So the serous membrane, these two pericardial layers, are actually secreting a fluid, and this is going to help prevent friction. So each of those 100,000 heartbeats a day, you're not sitting there like rubbing on an adjacent rib or something. And so it actually is really important. There are certain disorders, certain infectious states where you might actually find that fluid filling up, right? Eventually putting that fibrous pericardium to its largest stretch, and then the fluid will actually keep the heart from expanding the way it should. That's called cardiac tamponade, and that can be lethal as well. So, but it is overall, right? You're thinking of the pericardium as this really important triple-walled sac that the heart sits in and is protected by. If you're having trouble envisioning this, I really like this picture out of a previous textbook, particularly this like balloon example here, right? To think about parietal pericardium, visceral pericardium, right? Your fist is like the heart, and so you have this space that would be the pericardial cavity. Imagine that being filled by fluid, and so that's how it actually is protective. Okay, so let's look at the layers of the heart then. And this is where I said, as soon as we start talking about the heart, that visceral pericardium, the outer layer of the heart, is also called the epicardium, right? So they kept the parietal pericardium in here just so we could see it, and that space where the serous fluid would sit. But if we look at the heart wall, right, full thickness here, again, this just kind of got plucked out of context, but you can kind of see over here they're trying to indicate what that image is showing. So we're looking at the heart wall. So the epicardium, same as the visceral pericardium, it's basically just a simple squamous epithelium. Okay. As we move in, we get into the myocardium, right? And this is the true heart muscle, right? So myo should make you think muscle, cardium, heart. This is the cardiac muscle. We'll talk about it more, particularly in the physiology. If you think back, there's some special things about cardiac Muscle cells, these cells end up acting, every time the heart pumps, you want these cells to work in unison. And in fact, they do that. They act as what we call a functional syncytium. They act, right? They function as one. And this is due to, if you think back to cardiac muscle, these intercalated discs, right? You've got between adjacent cardiac muscle cells, you have this special structure where there are gap junctions, and this is actually letting action potentials move from one cell to the other, right? Ions were allowed to flow through there. In skeletal muscle, remember, you needed an individual neuron going to each cell to tell it to contract, and this time we're going to let these ions flow from cell to cell and cause that contraction. Also with the intercalated disc, you have desmosomes, which were that really strong cell-to-cell junction to make sure that when that cardiac muscle contracts, it doesn't pull itself away from an adjacent cell. As we move in then, we get to the endocardium, right? So epi is on the outside, endo is on the inside. And again, this is another layer. There's a little layer of areolar connective tissue, but primarily we're looking at here another layer of simple squamous epithelium. The endocardium is continuous with the valves. So when we start talking about valves, realize that's really just an extension of this endocardium. Same picture from your textbook. If you prefer this one, by all means, go for it. Okay, so let's take a look a little bit closer at some of the heart anatomy. And again, we'll do most of this in lab, right? That's where you probably really start to become the most comfortable with this terminology, but it's going to help everything if we have a shared terminology. So let's go for it. Okay, so the heart is made up of 4 chambers, right? We have, this is a rough drawing, right? But 2, maybe I should pick a different color. I don't think I get a choice. Okay. Oh, I do. Hold on, I just saw it. Try to think of what'll stand out here. Nice purple here, right? We have 2 atria. Atrium is the singular there. And atrium, are you guys familiar with that term? Think about where you've heard that before. It technically means like entryway. So someone might have like a atrium. I'm picturing like a little sunroom or like the entrance. Anyway, entryway. So these 2 chambers are the receiving chambers for blood returning to the heart. Vessels that return blood to the heart are always called veins. It does not matter if the blood is oxygenated or not. If it's going towards the heart, it's in a vein. So over here in the right atrium, we see the superior vena cava dropping blood into the right atrium and the inferior vena cava dropping blood into the right atrium. The left atrium, we have pulmonary veins, 2 from the left, and you can't see in this picture, but there's 2 from the right as well. But both atria are receiving blood. Oh, the one other place that we get, it's getting messy, one other place we receive blood from here is what's called the coronary sinus. And this is actually the blood from the cardiac circulation. There's a special set of vessels that just feed the heart. And the cardiac veins need to dump that blood back into the heart to get circulated again, and that comes through what's called the coronary sinus. So you will see that again. So again, atria, these are our receiving chambers. They really do very minimal contraction. Most of the movement of blood from the atria into the ventricles is through gravity, but they give a little squeeze. But you'll notice when you look, and you'll see this in lab too, the walls of these atria are pretty flimsy, right? And that's reflected in their function. Okay, our other 2, let me go back here. I wonder if I can clean this up for you. Ha. Okay, our other two chambers are going to be the ventricles. Right? If you remember your terminology for body directions, ventral, if you're talking about like an animal on all fours, you had dorsal, like a dorsal fin, and ventral then is that belly side. And so technically ventra is like this underside. And so here we have like the bottom of the heart. Okay. The ventricles are the actual pumps. Now, one of the strange things or things that's kind of counterintuitive with the heart is you have these two parallel pumps and they are going to pump equal volumes of blood with every contraction. But because we have a pulmonary circuit over here and the systemic circuit over here, they have very different workloads. So they pump equal volumes, but they have very different workloads. Think about the right ventricle over here. Look at how flimsy this wall is. It only needs to pump blood to the lungs, right? Your left ventricle over here has this big, thick, muscular wall because it's trying to pump blood to everywhere else in your body, right? So to the tips of your fingers, up into your brain, all those sorts of things. So what you'll end up seeing is that, like, if you measured the resistance or the blood pressure, the aorta is at like 5 times the resistance as those pulmonary arteries are. Okay. Oh, this is a good look at it, right? So same idea there. The left ventricle is so much thicker than the right ventricle. And that just reflects, again, the amount of work that has to happen. Now, this myocardium, this heart muscle, when it's contracting, realize this isn't set up nice and linearly like, say, skeletal muscle is. This muscle is very much kind of on an angle so that when the heart pumps, it's more like a ringing out motion. You'll see, this is, again, a figure from your book, 2011, and they're talking about the skeleton of the heart, right? And of course, this isn't part of like the skeleton. It's not truly a bone. But do realize embedded deep in here, there's lots of connective tissues. And some really tough connective tissues for these muscles to kind of crank and ring out against. Okay, so then this is kind of how it works, and we'll go into some more detail about the cardiac cycle later, but I thought this would help to think about it, right? So blood is filling both of those atria together, right? And the atria are nice and relaxed when that happens, but now we're actually going to start, I guess here they're starting with systole. So if you're familiar, right, with blood pressure, a normal blood pressure or average blood pressure is considered 120/80. Okay, and this is systolic, oh boy, over diastolic. Maybe cursive works better. There you go, systolic over diastolic. So the way I remember this, right, so systolic is the larger number. Systolic is the pressure when the heart is contracting, and diastolic or diastole is when that heart is relaxed. And so what we're going to see is that we're going to go through the atria contracting. So we have atrial systole, and it's pushing blood down into the ventricles. I know most of it's gravity. And when that happens, notice what has to happen here with the ventricles is they have to be relaxed. So we actually have, and this inner wheel kind of helps, ventricular diastole comes all the way around to here. The ventricles are relaxed while the atria are contracting, helping to fill them up, right? But then we're going to see that the ventricles start to contract, right? So we're in ventricular systole here, while the atria are relaxed. And so we kind of keep going back and forth. So now the ventricles during systole, we are pumping the blood, right, out of the heart, okay? And then basically immediately, as soon as that's done, blood starts filling the ventricles again. They have to be relaxed in order for them to fill, right? And then towards the end of that, we'll see that both chambers are actually relaxed. So they're basically putting in red that period of contraction. So atrial systole followed by ventricular systole followed by everyone being in diastole, right? So that filling can occur. And then the atria contract and then the ventricles contract. Okay. So we'll see this, but it kind of then starts to make sense. Oh, like our two pumps are together in the same organ, so that we can kind of keep this rhythm going. We can keep this happening. Okay. Fun, moving picture. So we got to talk about valves. So valves are super important, making sure that our blood is always flowing just in one direction. And this is actually going to save the heart a lot of work as long as these are functioning well. And I just thought particularly this image over here on the left is so cool. So this is an actual heart, right? And we can see here, up here, you're actually in the I guess one of the atria. I guess I'm not positive which one that is, but call that the right atrium. Then this is one of the atrioventricular valves, or sometimes you'll hear them called cuspid valves. Tricuspid valve is on the right. Bicuspid, also called the mitral valve, is on the left. I don't know why people get so into calling them cuspids. To me, it's a really simple term to call it the atrioventricular valve. You know exactly where it is. It's between the atria and the ventricle. But anyway, I thought that was a really cool imaging technique. Okay, before we all get dizzy, let's take a look at these valves while they're paused. Okay, so these images are super cool, but can be really challenging to follow. So notice what they've done here, right? They've cut a heart and kind of flipped back the top so that we're looking down into the heart. Left and right. So again, kind of spin yourself around to picture that. So here's the right atrioventricular valve, so between the atria and the ventricle, and the left atrial ventricular valve. So these atrioventricular valves are kind of set up, right? So blood can flow down from the atrium and fill the ventricle. But then when the ventricle is contracting, you don't want that blood just flowing back up into the atrium. You want to propel it out the vessels. And so here, as soon as blood starts pushing up, right, as the ventricle contracts, you kind of fill those cusps, those flaps of the valves. And in the atrioventricular valves, it's super cool. You have kind of these strings, these fibers called the chordae tendineae, and they are attached to these papillary muscles, these big ridges of muscle that you'll see coming up off of the ventricular wall. And that prevents the valve from flipping over inside out, right? So as the blood pushes up, the chordae tendineae kind of grab, they catch, right, and keep the valve in place. The semilunar valves, there is a pulmonary semilunar valve and an aortic semilunar valve. They work a little bit differently. So here we go. I'm just going to go the other way. So during this same contraction, blood was actually moving up into the aorta. And so this semilunar valve, it's actually kind of, you'll see it in lab, it kind of looks like little, this picture over here, little t-shirt pockets, right? Like I picture a pocket on your shirt, where if you go, in this case, in the direction of the pocket, you can just push it flat against your shirt and move right by, right? But as soon as the contraction of the ventricle stops, blood is going to start pooling back down into the aorta, right? There's no pressure. It's just gravity now. And so as blood comes back down, it gets caught in that t-shirt pocket and fills it up. And those pockets kind of squish together and make it so blood can't fall back into the ventricles. So really you have two different types of valves, these atrioventricular valves, which are between the atria and the ventricles, and these semilunar valves, which are in the openings of those great vessels. Okay, so a lot of different structures that we're mentioning there. So let's do this. No, we're going to do this in class. Okay. Yeah, I think, make sure this is still in the same section. Yes, we're still in the same section here. So let's real quick, this will be at the end of this video, the coronary circulation. So we mentioned earlier, the heart has its own blood supply. And this sometimes confuses people because you're thinking, why does it need its own circulation, right? It's completely full of blood. Shouldn't that be enough? But remember, this pump is getting no rest. And though it's filled with blood, it's probably really only that endocardial layer that would actually get oxygen from that blood. Remember, diffusion is really limited. It cannot go over big distances. And so instead, coming right off, here's the aorta, right? Coming right off the base of the aorta, we see part of our coronary circulation here. So these are all arteries we're looking at. And you don't have to know all of these, just a couple. So here's your left coronary artery and right coronary artery. So this is nice, right? Just directions. That left coronary artery is going to split. So one of the vessels is going to kind of keep wrapping around behind the heart. That's called the circumflex. And the other drops down kind of straight down the front of the heart. And this is called the anterior interventricular artery. So it's on the front, anterior, and it's between the ventricles. So interventricular artery. On the right-hand side, this right coronary artery is also going to split similarly. If you followed it around, this is shaded lighter because it's behind. The right coronary artery gives rise to the posterior interventricular artery, so going down the backside, and then also the right marginal artery. And so this is going to be kind of on that right-hand side of the right ventricle. So it continues to branch. Those are the main ones. Those are ones you should know the names of. Just because think about if you were to block one of these, right, and that's what causes heart attacks or myocardial infarction, a heart attack is going to be worse the larger the vessel that is blocked, right? So if you get off into some side branch over here, right, and this vessel gets blocked, there's a very small portion of heart tissue that's going to be damaged. But if you have a blockage in the left coronary artery, that's going to be a major problem, right? So knowing some of these names of the bigger branches becomes important. You also then get a corresponding kind of parallel venous structure here. So these are going to be what's draining the blood from the heart. And really here, I guess I just want to focus on, we see all of these coronary veins kind of coming back together, and on the posterior side of the heart, they all kind of join together into this, what they call a sinus, like an opening. This is the coronary sinus. It's like a sac. Opening's not a good term. I'm thinking like a sinus in your head. It's a sac. And then that drains into the right atrium. Okay. So particularly the coronary arteries, we are concerned with blockages leading to myocardial infarction. And so I thought this was a neat image. I actually pulled this out of a pathophysiology book. So this is what your blood vessels should look like throughout your body, right? Whether it's coronary or wherever. But basically what we'll see is in this process of atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, we start to kind of fill this vessel with junk. So what starts out as a little bit of damage, and we get platelets coming, and then white blood cells are responding, and next thing you know, where's my pointer? Next thing you know, those macrophages were trying to clean things up, and instead they turn into what are called foam cells, and we've got scar tissue, and we are slowly kind of filling up or occluding our blood vessel. And then, of course, which can be bad enough, you could eventually completely cut off blood supply. And then it gets even worse, right, if you have a thrombus or a clot that forms in this already narrowing blood vessel. So you want to know about that sort of stuff. We are going to take a break there, and we'll come back with some cardiac physiology.